Hey everyone, welcome to the Incubator Podcast. I'm your co-host Darren Boyd.
And this is Satbir and Darren. Today, we are very excited to get in the minds of a cybersecurity leader, a CISO, by the name of Nemi George. Nemi is the CISO at Pacific Dental Services. Very excited to have you, Nemi, and looking forward to our discussion here. Before we dive right in, Nemi, I would love to, just for our audience to get a better appreciation of who you are, a little bit of your background would be appreciated.
Hey, thanks for having me. Nemi George, CISO at Pacific Dental Services. We are a national DSO organization. It's a dental support organization. We provide IT services as well as business services to about 1,000 dental and medical offices across the country. I've been in this role or various aspects of this role for the last 7+ years. Prior to that, I was in a similar role, responsible for IT as well as security at Vodafone Global Enterprise. I was there for 9 years. Took a bit of a break. I did some consulting in between, and then I've been here since. Like I said, so happy to be here today.
Awesome, Nemi. We definitely want to again unpack what goes on in your mind, and I'm sure in the minds of your peers at that level. So without further ado, Nemi, there is so much happening in the global landscape. How or what are some of the things that are top of mind for you, as not only from an organization perspective, but just even if you take a step back, that shapes your thinking and the day-to-day aspects of how you approach your position?
A great question. I think if you really boil the role of a security leader down, it really comes down to perhaps two fundamental things. The first is user identity, right? Knowing that those you're granting access to are the right people, they're who they say they are, and having confirmed that they should have the right access or privilege to the things you're giving them access to. That is the first part of it. The second part of it is around the data itself, right? You've got to protect data, and that comes in different forms for different organizations. And, but you've got to understand your crown jewels. You've got to understand what means the most to your organization and decide how best to go about protecting it. And there's so much we talk about in this role, from ransomware to insider threats to cyber risk and business email compromise. There's a long list, but ultimately the two things that matter the most are, do you know who you're giving access to and what privilege they have? And should they even have that? Because you can have legitimate users who are just over privileged, but if you then switch to the other end of the spectrum, ultimately, what are they getting access to? The networks in the end don't matter as much. The applications don't really matter as much. The end goal is the data that they have access to. And so if you're able to focus your security program around identity and data security, then somewhere between those extremes, you will have a pretty good program.
Yeah, one of the questions, or a follow-up question on that, because I'd love to get, and one, it's amazing to join you virtually in your office, because whereas Satbir has more access to these types of conversations, I usually get some of the cascading initiatives that come out of offices such as yours. So this is a real treat for me. When you think of data, there's obviously a growing sentiment of what privacy should mean to the individual. There's so many concerns with regulations getting more and more strict about even your response timeliness, how you respond, what you disclose, and how you generally protect that data. With everything changing the way it is, how does a CISO stay on top of not only the regulations and how they're shifting, but what that actually means to your business? And when you kind of opened up your intro, 1,000 different, call them dental services, is a phenomenal footprint to even consider protecting. So how do you start thinking about, I guess, approaching that and prioritizing some of your responses in that domain unto itself?
Well, it's always interesting when you take compliance into the mix of security because compliance doesn't always equal security, but it certainly, when done right, can help build your security program. But to answer your question, Darren, I think the easiest way is go for the most stringent compliance and regulatory framework, right? So I've come from Europe, where essentially, most countries would have a national directive, and that's it. You abide by that directive. It's relatively easy. Like most people would know about, DPA or now GDPR and so on. But across the pond in the US, you have different states having different mandates, different regulations. Depending on the industry you're in most regulated industries, you then have industry specific organizations that you also have to adhere to. And so the first thing is just understanding the landscape. You've got to know your business. There's no easy way of doing it. Some of them are obvious, right? In healthcare, you've got to do HIPAA, you've got to, understand if you're taking payments, you've got to do, the payment, PCI, regulatory compliance, and so on. So those are the obvious ones. But then there are other things like health IT, where you have to do self-attestation. There's SOC 2, there's ISO 27001. In California, over the last few years, we've had CCPA and now CPRA, which will start being enforced in the new year, in a few months. And so you take all of these, what I call control objectives, right? So you boil down these various standards and regulations, and you ask yourself a basic fundamental question. What is the control objective? What is this control? What is this regulation seeking to do? Let's take something simple like multi-factor authentication. Every, the approach to MFA might differ, but essentially, MFA is the same. You should have multiple factors to authenticate. So once you've got that as a baseline, you then look through the other, all the different standards that you subscribe to or you're mandated to, oblige to. And then you see, what do they say about MFA, right? Different factors, what's allowed, what's permissible, what's not. And then you essentially pitch your tent and say, this is where I want to be. If I comply with this approach to MFA, and I'm likely going to tick the box for all the others, and then you do that. So that's the way that I tend to go about it. Now there's so many tools. You can have GRC tools. Some people just do manual Excel with spreadsheet and pivot tables. However you do it, it's somewhat immaterial. The main thing is try to aggregate the controls together, so you're not spinning around from one framework, one regulatory requirement to the other. Aggregate your responses, so when you do one thing, you can clearly attribute that control and its effectiveness to the various regulatory frameworks and standards that require that level of control.
Nemi, just building on that, right, is so that's complex in of itself to understand. You have a GRC group perhaps underneath yourself that is managing all of that stuff. And then, as you rightfully mentioned, you take those control objectives and you manifest it in some sort of technology implementation, right, to address that. So it's the compliance check. Here's the control objective. Here's the details, and we've checked the box. How do you actually shift that compliance mindset into, hey, what is my true risk approach to this? How do I qualify and quantify the risk in the organization now? Right. So how do we see the effectiveness of those controls manifesting themselves from a risk posture or even a threat, maybe posture perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question, because most organizations ask themselves a fundamental question: how much is too much? When do you stop? When have you invested enough money into bolstering your defenses, into building out your information security program? And it really boils down to what you asked. At what point is the risk acceptable to a level that you're able to manage it? Or at what point do you feel your controls are effective enough that you don't need to supplement more, additional controls? To a great degree, the answer to that is subjective, right? It all depends on your risk appetite and tolerance within your organizations. But here's what I would say. Most organizations fundamentally don't know how to measure risk. And so the how you know whether you are effective or not almost becomes a neat question if you don't know how to measure the risk. There's so many ways of doing this, right? ISO 27001 is a good framework. NIST, cybersecurity framework, is another one. I'll probably just pivot between both of them. But they have a general approach to risk, which is understand your assets first. What is it? What is the asset? What is the thing you're trying to protect? Let's take, for instance, it's a laptop, right? Then you understand what are the vulnerabilities? Right? What are those areas where you can compromise a laptop? And that sometimes can go down a rabbit hole because depending on how well you look, you're just going to find stuff, right? Is that laptop internet connected? Is it a kiosk machine? Do multiple people use it? Each of those questions opens up a wormhole of risk. Then you then understand what are the risks, right? What are the possibilities to exploit those vulnerabilities that you've discovered? That if you can kind of picture a mind map, this is starting to really build into this huge spaghetti mess. And then you then look at each of those risks that you've identified, right? The essentially, how do you get the risk, the threat actors, and the likelihood that is going to be successful, and then you obviously get your risk. You then hopefully you have some quantifiable way of doing this, and I always prefer quantitative rather than qualitative because it gives you a little bit more of a tangible approach, right? And just for the audience, by qualitative you just use simple high, medium, low, right? It's very broad and things kind of fall between the cracks. I tend to use a more metric driven approach where I have a finite number, usually between 0 and 50. Do something that is broad enough so you can have degrees of separation, but don't make it too broad that it doesn't make sense. I have seen risk registers in the past where a particular risk has a risk score of, say, 23,000, and another risk has a risk score of 100. Like, how do you determine the gap between 100 and 23,000? It literally makes no sense. Now, once you've taken that approach and you've broken all of that out, you then need to have a process internally that determines how you deal with risk. And this is often where security professionals fail, because we tend to think that we own risk and that we should manage risk, right? But we have to build alliances and collaborations across the organization. There's something that I refer to as a business impact level. So there are different approaches, but you could say, I'm going to have an operational impact level. I'm going to have something to do with reputation. I'm going to have something to do with my customers and operations, infrastructure and so on. As an example, if my infrastructure is down for over 8 hours, is that considered a catastrophic incident to my organization? If I have a breach that only makes it into the local media, right, Orange County Business Journal, is that considered a level 3 risk versus if the same risk made it into the Washington Post? You've got to determine and predetermine that prior to an incident. Based on those business impact levels, you're then able to say, if this risk falls above a threshold for, say, a high risk, these are the actions that we're going to take to mitigate that risk to bring it down to an acceptable level. So going back to your original question, it's a whole process of sort of risk management, which is identifying the risk, qualifying the risk, deciding a risk mitigation plan, which has got to go beyond IT, beyond information security. It's going to involve other stakeholders, and then building out a plan. And then at some point, you bring that risk down into an acceptable, tolerant level. And then depending on your appetite, you may decide to further reduce the risk or accept the risk. But there are two key things to point out. One is, how much is too much, right? You get to a point of maturity where you are, let's say, you're using a CMMI scale and you're at a 3/5. You might invest another $1 million into your security defenses and only take your maturity to a 3.5. right? At that point, you've got to make a business decision if that's worth the investment, or if you're going to do other more cost-effective controls, like just training your employees better, right, to be able to spot and respond to those sort of incidents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One quick follow-on, I mean, this is more from your vantage point. As a CISO, you participate in many organizations, ISACA like groups, and you get this broad purview of what's happening. Would you say many organizations truly operate more on a compliance-driven and approach to, let's say, InfoSec and prioritization, or are they actually effectively doing risk-based prioritization, as you've just very eloquently highlighted the direction?
I think it does depend, right, on the type of organization primarily. So heavily regulated industries tend to have a more compliance-driven approach to risk or to security generally, which isn't a terribly bad idea if you use the compliance frameworks that you have and essentially use that to drive or fund your security program. And just on that latter point, if your organization is regulated and you know that you need to adhere, meet certain regulatory or even legal requirements, then the board understands that language so much more than they understand controls, vulnerabilities, breaches, and so on. So use that to your advantage. Use that to get the funding you need to build your security program effectively. And if you do that effectively, it almost 100% of the time will ensure that you're able to meet those compliance objectives. So that's the first approach. The second approach, which you mentioned, is more of a risk-based approach. This is more of a corporate oversight internally, in some cases driven by the need to report to stakeholders and the board, and also effective because you tend to, the fact that you have board level oversight means that there is always a bottom-up flow of risk. The problem with this sometimes is that you never get into the core operational risk, right? Most boards and execs only want to hear about the top 5 risks, for instance. They only want to deal with the enterprise, overarching risk, which is great. However, if you don't have a well-defined process that addresses those lower operational risks, then usually those are the things that catch you. Those are the areas where you end up getting breached. Then there's another approach to security, which is more of an operational approach. And this is where you hear a lot of CISOs, especially newer CISOs, and they just talk about red team, blue team, right? It's almost about hacking and threat hunting and offensive security, and they want to invest as much as they can in their security operations team. And this is sort of the hacking central. Everyone is pumped and everyone is going after the bad guys. Absolutely fine, nothing wrong with it. But then there is so much more to security than just the operational aspects to it. So I think, having said all that, I kind of go with a somewhat unique approach, which is a blend of all of that. And I just call it enterprise security, which is just look at your organization, right? What are you guys doing? What are your crown jewels? If you're in healthcare, that's your patient information. Those are your medical records, right? Your insurance records, the integrations you have with your service providers, within, with the various labs, with the various carriers, and so on. Ensure that you've really, really protected those. Start there, right, at an enterprise level. Then look internally. Who are your most risky departments? Not because there's anything wrong they're doing, it's just the nature of their job. So if you have people in finance, for instance, if you have people within your payments team, right, so your procurement third-party management teams, focus on those guys. See how you can train them and provide them with the best tools, and tools not always meaning technology, but the best knowledge and awareness to be able to identify and defend themselves against those threats. Right, you focus on those. And the other part that I always mention, because people forget this, is security should really be an enabler for business. So solve some business problems. right? Look around the organization. What are the things that you can solve? Because often security tends to throw more gates in the way, right? More governance steps, more oversight. We slow things down. So look around the organization. What are things that you can do to speed up day-to-day business? I'll give you maybe two examples to make this case. My identity team doesn't sit within my security organization. My identity group sits within my digital process improvements team, because I see identity as playing such a key central enablement role within the organization, but I don't want it to be sort of stifled or confined by the information security team. And here's why. We in our industry, we hire a lot of doctors. Doctors are not cheap, right? You hire doctors, they come into your organization. In most cases, because they have to go through a security checklist, they don't get access for 2-3 days. That's 2-3 days of having a highly paid doctor sitting around twiddling their thumbs without access to the systems. Or the opposite is actually even worse, which is someone gives them their access so they can get productive day one. So now you're sharing credentials. You've got a doctor that has just come into your organization, and from day one, you're already introducing bad practice to them by telling them it's okay to share credentials with someone else if they can get their credentials on time. So by moving the identity team into what is a business process enablement team, their focus is on automation, self-service, speed of resolution, and just enabling the business to get functional, seeing security and identity as enabling access rather than the need to restrict access. And it's a subtle mind shift, but it's a fundamental difference of how you can use your security to drive business rather than hinder your business operation.
I think I think anybody listening to this is going to have an incredible appreciation for the number of factors and how to balance them. I love how you articulated that. And I especially appreciate the enablement aspect, because I think that is a wonderful way to look at it. And also, you said something earlier about partnering with the organization. I imagine that's a part of it. But I started thinking about something that Satbir and I run into a lot, which is we work with a lot of organizations that are taking on more and more development practices. So IT is getting very capable in building fairly complex and nuanced solutions, whether it be completely from scratch or in a cloud context, enabling via these building blocks. And one of the things that strikes me is, in some cases, this is going to the enablement and how to partner. In some cases, we have a factor of 120 developers to every InfoSec practitioner. And we often see still the InfoSec team will cascade a set of reports to these development communities and say, here's all of the things you need to fix. And then they'll start trying to find ways to work with them to fix it. But it's often met with a response that makes it almost a denial of service back, where it's very difficult for them to partner. So how do you view, I guess, building these relationships, building these partnerships? How do we break down some of those walls, and how do we work together as an organization to enable some of this? Because there's so much to do in every case. So what are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I would answer it this way. I mean, great point. And I always tell security folks internally and when I speak at different events, you've really got to get up and go out and build relationships, right? Build relationships. I'll give you a simple example that is completely off tangent, but I guess makes the point. A few years ago, in the middle of all the COVID craziness that was going on, I had my security analyst, someone on my team, come to me and tell me that, hey, I think we have some, suspicious activity. We had a user logging in from the Philippines, and this was unusual, and this was this and this was that, and it was, it was in their weekly updates to me and all that good stuff. And this came to me 2 or 3 times. And at some point, cut a long story short, I picked up the phone digitally. So I sent an internal instant message to the manager of this team member, and I said, "Hey, there's someone on your team who is logging in from the Philippines. Are you aware of it?" And he goes, "Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he's in the Philippines. His mom is ill, and yeah, we allowed him to go to the Philippines to work for a couple of days, and he'll be back soon." So, a bunch of emails, a bunch of reports, risk updates, you name it, and we're getting traffic from the Philippines. This is this. There are two things. First of all, my security team could have asked a very, very basic question, right? Rather than spin up all this fuss over nothing. And secondly, if you looked at the traffic to see that, yes, it's from the Philippines, but there's nothing malicious going on. He's logging in and he's doing his day-to-day pattern. There's nothing abnormal to his traffic behavior or the application he's accessing. The only thing that was fundamentally different was just the time of day that the access was carried out. So we've got to learn to talk to one another. It's so basic, but it's fundamentally transformative if you do that. The second thing is, over the past few years, people have used the phrase shift left. You've got to go to the source, and it's great because you use the example of developers. There's a lot of time, a lot of people that are required to build applications. And oftentimes the security teams are so far removed from that process and only come in when those teams come to them at various approval gates. That is too late and too far down the line. You've got to get engaged. Now, some practical ways you can get engaged with your organization. The first thing I would say is just have some type of technical security basics, right? So empower the teams to know what is right and what's wrong. If you haven't gone through secure coding practices, for instance, with your organization and the developers within your organization, you cannot expect them to code securely. It's just bonkers. You can't do it. So invest the time, have a training budget that says, hey, I'm going to get all my developers in the room, and I'm going to show you how to do secure coding. That's the first step. Once you've done that, memorialize that in a set of technical QRGs, security guidelines, frameworks, whatever you use within your organizations. But don't make it some 30, 40-page document. Make it something clear, something interactive, something that they can use, and co-develop it with them. The truth is there are very few true security professionals that know applications better than application developers. So you can't just throw it over the fence. It's like having the regulators tell a brain surgeon how to carry out brain surgery. It just doesn't work. You've got to work with them, collaborate with them, and build the standards. That's the second sort of piece. The third piece is share your tools. All right, this is going to come as a shock to most security people, but share your tools. If you have, a DAST tool, a SAS tool, whatever it is that you use to scan code, provide access to your teams, to your dev teams. It's much better for them to scan and test as they go. The different sprints, the different updates, different, releases that they have, rather than building this monolith application and then coming to you to spend 2 weeks to test the application, to then tell them all the things they've done wrong. In most cases, there's a deadline they have to meet. You're already pissing people off, or you're forcing them to cut corners, or you're just seen as getting in the way of the business moving forward. So very practical, very reasonable, doesn't require a ton of innovation. Just talk to people, train them, give them the guardrails on what to do, give them the tools that they need. I often talk about what I refer to as the QA approach to security. And think about an old sort of auto plant where you have the workers on the level below slaving away all day, putting cars together or whatever it is that they're piecing together. And then you have the QA supervisor who stands on the floor above with a clipboard, maybe wearing, glasses with a white overall coat. And he stands there all day and he comes down at the end of the shift with his little 100-line checklist and is walking around and looking at everything and, well, that doesn't fit and that doesn't fit and you've got to redo that again. And the guys are looking at him like, you're great. Like, if you had told me 8 hours ago, right, I could have fixed that rather than wait till the end of the shift. And now, in some cases, I'm going to scrap what I have done to do it again. Security people sometimes get obsessed with the power that they wield in being able to come in and stop a process rather than being seen as enabling the process to go through smoothly.
Yeah. Nemi, this has been a beautiful discussion into the minds of a CISO like yourself. I think the pragmatic examples, even what you just highlighted in the three-part process of shift left and underscores, I would say, a theme of context. If only everyone was able to establish that context through communication, through dialogue, and through the right training methods, and then appropriately sharing the tool sets, things move forward. So I hope our audience today got as much out of this discussion as we did, again, from the minds of a CISO, how to pragmatically look at risk, look at the context of the environment, how to approach approach the changing landscape and world we live in from a cybersecurity perspective. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Nemi.